In the spring of 2026, Mount Everest looks less like a remote frontier and more like a narrow corridor of ambition. Satellite images show long lines of climbers waiting patiently above the clouds, each step measured, each breath borrowed. At over 8,000 meters, where the air holds only a fraction of the oxygen the human body expects, the mountain enters what climbers call the death zone. It's a place where mistakes compound quickly, and where ethics become as thin as the air itself. As traffic increases, an uncomfortable question has returned to the center of mountaineering debate. When someone collapses high on Everest, what is the right thing to do? The instinct to help is deeply human. But up here, help can cost more than it saves. Every rescue attempt risks turning one emergency into several. Every pause drains oxygen, strength, and time resources that cannot be replaced. This is not a new dilemma, but it has never felt more urgent. Commercial expeditions, fixed ropes, and improved forecasting have opened Everest to more people than ever before. Yet the mountain's biology has not changed. Human limits remain stubbornly fixed, even as expectations rise. Tonight, on K2 Stories, we're stepping carefully into this moral gray zone, not to judge and not to dramatize, but to understand how did the unwritten rescue ethics of Everest form? Why do experienced climbers sometimes walk past those in trouble? And are we approaching a turning point where the old rules no longer work? To answer that, we have to begin where all Everest decisions truly start, above 8,000 meters, where survival itself is never guaranteed. Above 8,000 meters, Everest stops behaving like a mountain and starts behaving like a biological filter. The death zone is not a metaphor. It's a threshold beyond which the human body begins to fail simply by existing. Oxygen pressure drops so low that even resting feels like exertion. Muscles weaken. Judgment slows. Simple decisions take enormous effort. This is the invisible line where ethics collide with physiology. Climbers don't enter the death zone casually. They pass through it knowing that their bodies are operating on borrowed time. Medical research is blunt on this point. Prolonged exposure at these altitudes leads to rapid physical decline, even in elite athletes. Supplemental oxygen can slow the process, but it does not stop it. Every step upward is a calculation. How much oxygen remains? How much strength is left? How much margin still exists? That margin is what makes rescue such a fraught concept. At lower altitudes, stopping to help someone is an inconvenience. In the death zone, stopping can be fatal. Assisting another climber means sharing oxygen, slowing movement, and extending exposure to an environment that is already overwhelming the body. What feels like a moral imperative at sea level becomes a potentially irreversible decision above the South Pole. Statistics reflect this harsh reality. Survival rates for climbers who experience serious trouble above 8,000 meters drop sharply, even with assistance. The mountain does not reward effort or intention. It responds only to physics and biology. Wind, cold, and altitude are indifferent to human values. This is why rescue decisions on Everest are rarely simple yes or no choices. They exist in a narrow space where good intentions can lead to cascading consequences. And yet the instinct to help does not disappear at altitude. Many climbers describe a powerful internal conflict when encountering someone in distress. Years of training, cultural norms, and basic empathy collide with the cold arithmetic of survival. Do you stop and risk your own life? Do you call for help, knowing it may not arrive in time? Or do you continue upward or downward carrying the weight of that decision forever? This tension is what separates Everest from almost every other environment on Earth. In most emergencies, rescue ethics are clear: preserve life whenever possible. On Everest, the definition of possible is brutally narrow. The death zone strips away abstraction and forces decisions in real time, under physical and cognitive stress that few people will ever experience. Historically, climbers learned these limits through painful trial and error. Early expeditions approached Everest with ideals borrowed from lower mountains: team loyalty, mutual aid, collective responsibility. But the mountain consistently punished those assumptions. Over time, an unspoken understanding emerged. Above a certain height, each climber becomes largely responsible for their own survival. This was never written down as a rule, but it became embedded in expedition culture. High camps operate on the assumption that rescue options are extremely limited. Sherpa teams, who often carry heavier loads and make repeated trips through dangerous zones, understand this reality more clearly than anyone. For them, the death zone is not a symbolic boundary. It is a workplace where risk accumulates daily. What complicates matters today is scale. Everest is no longer climbed by a handful of small, highly experienced teams. In recent seasons, hundreds of climbers may occupy the upper mountain within the same weather window. Skill levels vary widely. Some climbers move efficiently and decisively. Others struggle with pacing, oxygen management, or basic altitude adaptation. This density magnifies ethical pressure. When many people are present, the expectation of collective responsibility increases. Surely someone else can help. Surely resources can be pooled. But in the death zone, more people often means more problems, not more solutions. Bottlenecks form. Oxygen runs low. Decisions become rushed. The invisible line above 8,000 meters does not care how crowded it is. It enforces the same limits it always has. And as more climbers cross it each year, the question becomes harder to avoid. Are the ethics that evolved for a quieter, less commercial Everest still adequate for the mountain we see today? To understand how those ethics solidified and why they are now being challenged, we have to look at the unwritten laws that govern life in the high camps, where tradition, necessity, and survival intersect. High on Everest, long before climbers reach the summit, they enter a social system with no official handbook. There are no written rescue statutes posted at Camp Phi, no formal chain of command once climbers clip into the final fixed lines. What exists instead is a set of unwritten laws, norms shaped by decades of experience, loss, and hard-earned restraint. These norms did not emerge from indifference. They emerged from failure. In the early history of Himalayan climbing, teams often carried the ethical frameworks of lower-altitude mountaineering with them. The idea of leave no one behind was treated as absolute. Entire expeditions would halt, or even turn around, to assist a struggling teammate. On Everest, those decisions sometimes ended with multiple people in trouble instead of one. The mountain taught its lessons slowly and at a terrible cost. Over time, climbers began to accept a painful truth. Above a certain altitude, rescue attempts frequently exceed human capability. The decision to stop is no longer just about compassion. It becomes a risk assessment that includes everyone involved. As a result, a different ethic took root. Not a lack of care, but a recalibration of responsibility. Nowhere is this more clearly understood than among the Sherpa community. Sherpas have carried the physical and moral weight of Everest for generations. They fix ropes, ferry supplies, and often move through the most dangerous sections of the mountain multiple times in a single season. Their exposure to risk is cumulative, in a way that most clients never experience. For Sherpas, rescue ethics are inseparable from survival economics. Each additional trip through the death zone compounds danger. Each rescue attempt must be weighed not just against the life in immediate trouble, but against the safety of the team, the responsibility to family back home, and the reality that one mistake can end a career, or worse. Yet their perspective is often simplified or overlooked in popular narratives. Media coverage tends to frame rescue decisions as moral failures or acts of heroism, rarely acknowledging the structural pressures Sherpas operate under. They are expected to be selfless, resilient, and endlessly capable, even as traffic increases and margins shrink. Within high camps, another principle quietly governs behavior: the collective good. When weather windows are short and oxygen supplies are limited, decisions are often made to protect the majority, rather than the individual. This is not callousness. It is triage under extreme conditions. Turning one climber around might save several others. Delaying descent for a rescue attempt could expose dozens to worsening weather. These choices are rarely discussed openly on the mountain. There is no time for debate and no appetite for second-guessing when survival is at stake. Most climbers understand this implicitly. They train for self-sufficiency, carry personal oxygen reserves, and accept that above 8,000 meters, help may not come, but acceptance does not equal comfort. Many climbers describe the high camps as emotionally quiet places, not peaceful, but subdued. Conversations are brief, eye contact is fleeting. Everyone understands that decisions made here will echo long after the expedition ends. What makes this ethical framework fragile is how dependent it is on shared expectations. It works best when climbers are similarly experienced, similarly prepared, and similarly aware of the risks. As Everest has become more accessible, that alignment has weakened. Some climbers arrive with assumptions shaped by commercial guarantees or rescue narratives that don't reflect reality at altitude. This mismatch creates tension. When expectations collide with capability, the unwritten laws are tested. Resentment can build between clients and guides, between climbers and Sherpas, between idealism and physics. The mountain does not resolve these conflicts, it simply amplifies them. To see how these unwritten laws play out in real time, we have to examine specific moments, decisions made on the edge, under pressure, where there were no good options. These are the case files that continue to define Everest's ethical landscape. Some decisions on Everest never truly end. They linger, not because they were wrong or right, but because they were unavoidable. These moments become reference points, quietly studied, debated, and reinterpreted by every generation of climbers that follows. One of the most discussed symbols in this conversation is known informally as green boots. Over time, the name stopped referring to a person and began functioning as a location marker, an unintended consequence of permanence at altitude. What unsettles people is not the individual story, but what the story represents. The normalization of loss in an environment where recovery is often impossible. In the death zone, the mountain does not allow closure in familiar ways. It preserves decisions as much as it preserves geography. For climbers moving past such markers, the ethical tension is immediate but compressed. There is no space for extended reflection. Oxygen is limited. Weather can shift without warning. The mind narrows its focus to the next step, the next anchor point, the next breath. Later, sometimes years later, the questions surface. Could something have been done differently? Should something have been done differently? Documented cases reveal a consistent pattern. Rescue attempts at extreme altitude succeed only under rare, highly specific conditions. Early intervention, favorable weather, sufficient oxygen reserves, and rescuers with enough remaining strength to absorb the cost. When any one of these factors is missing, the probability of success drops sharply. Climbers know this. Guides know it. Sherpas know it better than anyone. Yet knowing the odds does not make the moment easier. Survivors of high-altitude rescue decisions often describe a psychological aftermath that rivals the physical ordeal. Even when choices align with established norms, the internal reckoning can be relentless. These are not decisions made in calm rooms with clear data. They are made while exhausted, hypoxic, and acutely aware of personal vulnerability. Unlike many other professions that deal with life and death choices, Everest climbers rarely have formal support systems afterward. There are no structured debriefings, no mandatory counseling, no institutional acknowledgement of moral injury. Climbers return home carrying private narratives that may never fully resolve. This psychological toll extends beyond individuals. It shapes expedition culture. Teams may grow quieter after difficult encounters. Trust can erode subtly, not through blame, but through unspoken doubt. Did we do everything we could? Did we expect too much from others? Did the mountain force our hand? Or did we surrender agency too quickly? Importantly, these questions are not academic. They influence future behavior. Climbers who have faced impossible choices often become more conservative. They turn around earlier. They enforce stricter turnaround times. They carry more oxygen. In this way, past ethical dilemmas quietly recalibrate future risk tolerance. At the same time, controversial decisions tend to harden public opinion outside the climbing community. Isolated incidents are sometimes extracted from context and judged by standards that do not apply at altitude. The nuance disappears. Complexity collapses into accusation or hero worship. This disconnect matters because it feeds back into the system. Increased scrutiny leads to pressure on guides, on Sherpas, on expedition leaders to attempt rescues that may not be viable. The expectation of intervention grows, even as the mountain's constraints remain unchanged. What makes Everest unique is that it does not adapt to human values. Human values must adapt to it. When they don't, the consequences are swift and uncompromising. The most sobering lesson from these case files is not that climbers sometimes make tragic choices, it's that they often face choices where every option carries loss. The death zone compresses morality into moments measured in minutes and meters. As traffic increases and technology advances, many ask whether these dilemmas will become less frequent or more complex. To answer that, we need to look forward. The ethics of Everest are no longer shaped only by experience and tradition, but by innovation, commercialization, and the promise and limits of modern solutions. That evolution may redefine what rescue means on the world's highest mountain. Or it may reveal that some boundaries cannot be crossed, no matter how advanced we become. In recent years, the idea that technology might solve Everest's ethical impasse has gained quiet momentum. Drones, real-time biometric monitoring, advanced forecasting, and lighter oxygen systems all suggest a future where rescue is faster, safer, and more predictable. But the death zone has a way of exposing the gap between theoretical capability and operational reality. High-altitude drone rescue, for example, is often discussed as a breakthrough. In controlled tests, drones can reach extreme elevations. In practice, the challenges multiply quickly. Battery efficiency drops sharply in sub-zero temperatures. Thin air reduces lift. Strong, erratic winds complicate navigation. Payload limits make human extraction unrealistic in most terrain. Even precision delivery, such as dropping oxygen, requires near-perfect conditions and coordination. Technology can assist, but it cannot replace human judgment or physical presence where the mountain is steep, narrow, and unstable. Commercialization introduces another layer of complexity. Everest is now an ecosystem of operators with vastly different standards, resources, and philosophies. Some expeditions emphasize conservative decision-making and strict turnaround rules. Others market the summit as a product, implicitly shifting responsibility away from clients. This uneven landscape complicates rescue ethics. When climbers assume support will always be available, they may take risks they are not prepared to manage alone. The burden of this expectation often falls on Sherpas. As traffic increases, so does pressure for intervention. Yet Sherpas are finite resources operating in an infinite risk environment. In response, there have been important internal efforts to rebalance responsibility. Advanced training programs now focus on decision authority at altitude, not just technical skill. Some initiatives aim to establish dedicated high-altitude rescue teams that operate beyond a single expedition, funded collectively to reduce ad hoc risk-taking. There is also growing discussion around formalizing what has long been informal. Mandatory go-no-go criteria tied to weather, oxygen reserves, and turnaround times could remove individual hesitation from critical moments. Independent review boards, similar to aviation incident analysis, have been proposed to study high-altitude emergencies without assigning blame, focusing instead on systemic improvement. These ideas represent a cultural shift. For decades, Everest operated on personal accountability and unwritten codes. Now, the scale of activity demands structure. The challenge is implementing oversight without creating false confidence. Rules can guide decisions, but they cannot eliminate uncertainty in an environment where conditions change faster than policy can adapt. At the heart of this evolution is a deeper question. What is Everest for? Is it a proving ground for human endurance, or a shared space that requires collective restraint? Modern climbers are increasingly aware that success is not defined solely by standing on the summit. Many now measure achievement by how they move on the mountain, how early they turn around, how conservatively they manage oxygen, how they minimize risk to others. This shift does not erase ethical dilemmas, but it reframes them. Rescue becomes one component of a broader responsibility to prevent emergencies from arising in the first place. Preparation, humility, and self-limitation begin to carry as much moral weight as courage. As Everest continues to evolve, its rescue ethics will likely remain unresolved. Not because climbers fail to care, but because care alone is insufficient at 8,000 meters. The mountain enforces limits that no amount of innovation can fully overcome. What remains is a reckoning, not just with technology or policy, but with the values that climbers bring with them when they step onto the highest slopes on Earth. And that reckoning extends far beyond the summit itself. In the end, Everest does not ask climbers what they believe, it tests what they understand. Above 8,000 meters, ideals collide with biology, and ambition meets limits that cannot be negotiated. The ethical dilemmas that unfold in the death zone are not failures of character. They are symptoms of an environment that strips away excess and leaves only what truly matters: time, oxygen, judgment, and the irreversible consequences of delay. What the mountain teaches, again and again, is that rescue ethics cannot be separated from prevention. The most humane decision is often made long before anyone is in trouble. Choosing conservative turnaround times, respecting weather forecasts, carrying sufficient reserves, and acknowledging when personal limits have been reached. These choices rarely make headlines, but they save lives quietly. There is a growing recognition within the mountaineering community that responsibility does not begin at the moment of crisis. It begins with preparation, honesty, and restraint. It begins with understanding that no summit is worth transferring risk onto someone else, especially those whose labor and exposure already carry a disproportionate burden. Everest will always involve risk. That is part of its nature and part of its draw. But risk does not require recklessness. The evolving ethics of the mountain suggest a shift away from conquest and toward coexistence, moving with the environment rather than against it, accepting that survival is not a secondary outcome, but the primary measure of success. Perhaps the most difficult lesson is also the simplest. On Everest, not every problem has a solution. Not every life can be saved, no matter how strong the intention. Accepting this is not surrender, it is clarity. And clarity, at altitude, is one of the most valuable resources a climber can have. There is a phrase often repeated among experienced mountaineers, not as a slogan, but as a reminder carved by experience. On Everest, reaching the summit is optional. Coming back alive is not. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe that understanding the mountain is as important as climbing it, thank you for spending this time with K2 Stories. These are not just tales of height and hardship, but reflections on human choice at the very edge of possibility.